It's a great story of people who were determined to transform the environment, people who had passion, and people who just didn't know how to say no.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find inspirational people who are doing inspirational things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have a special guest, Phillip Nyakpo, who is a journalist, author, and proud father. Welcome to the podcast, Phillip. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well. Thank you very much. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to spend time with you, to have a great conversation. I really look forward to it because I really love what you're doing with the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Thank you, Phillip. It's great to have you on the show as well. And it's great to have this conversation regarding your book that you've released recently, Absolute Radio. So it'll be great to get into the discussion and have a conversation about that and some of the overarching themes and concepts of the book. Before we get started, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Phillip Nyakpo?
Thank you very much, Tessa. And yes, well, my name is Phillip Nyakpo. I was born and raised in Ghana until the age of 22. And that was back in 1996. And then I had my first opportunity to travel outside Ghana in Africa. And it brought me all the way to Australia, Sydney, Australia, totally unexpected. And they got me into the newsroom of Channel 7. Now, Channel 7, it's probably like maybe Channel 4 in the UK, very popular, even back then in 1996. And that's actually where I fell in love with broadcast journalism. And so eventually I returned to Ghana, same year in 1996, and so wanted to go into broadcasting, except the opportunity was severely limited. Those days, there were no private radio stations or TV stations. There was only the state broadcaster. So I ended up as a journalist writing for the Ghanaian Chronicle. The Ghanaian Chronicle is the most popular private newspaper in Ghana. And then later on, I started writing also for radio and TV magazine, a very new magazine that was in Ghana. And then in 1997, something miraculous happened. The city where I lived, Sekondi-Takoradi, the first private radio station came. I happened to be among the first employees. And that just started the rest of my trajectory in life, because then I started really doing what I loved, broadcast journalism. And then many years later, close to 10 years later, through an arrangement with the BBC, I went to England for 2 years, had a stint with the BBC. And there, that time, I met my wife, who happens to be an Australian. And so in 2007, I ended up here in Perth, Western Australia. So that was 15 years ago. And now, 2 kids later, I am very much an Australian living in Perth, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. We're thought to be the most isolated city in the world. And Tessa, when we spoke weeks ago, you did say to me that you visited Perth before.
Yes.
That made me very happy, because I thought, well, this is a place to come and see, because it is truly beautiful, not just isolated.
Yes, I actually have one of my best friends who lives in Perth with his family, originally from the UK, similar to yourself. Met a beautiful Australian woman, moved over. He also now has 2 kids.
Fortunate man, just like me.
Oh, definitely. So thank you for that introduction and giving us an insight to your earlier life and journey into journalism. One of the things that sparked our initial conversation was the book that you published, which is Absolute Radio, which is an extremely inspiring story about the first private radio station in Ghana's Western region?
That is correct, Tessa.
Okay, so what I wanted to know is what was the impetus or what was the reason for writing the book? What gave you that bug to pick up the pen and say, I'm going to write a book about absolute radio?
Well, Tessa, just imagine this, right? You witnessed the sinking of the Titanic.
Mm-hmm.
Why on earth would you not live to tell that story? And not just this thinking, but imagine if you saw the Titanic being built, not just being built, but being dreamt of. You know, someone says, this is what we're going to do. They started to put pen to paper, designing it over years of hard work, uncertainty, doubts. You want to live to tell that story. So this story I've written in Absolute Radio, capturing the story of the first private radio in Ghana's Western region, feels like that to me because it's a story of flesh, blood, and bones, people, women, and men who came together and say, we'll do this. And it started as an idea in the head of one simple guy. And, you know, when I think about it, I go like, even as you talk to me right now about it, I feel like maybe I should just rewrite it all because maybe I haven't written it the way it ought to be written.
Or maybe you've missed out some key points, who knows?
It's a great story of people who were determined to transform the environment, people who had passion, and people who just didn't know how to say no.
So it's clear that this was an extremely pivotal, important part of your life and has had a huge impact. There must be something else within that story in terms of the need to tell authentic African stories that made you write this book. What is it, if you can go a little bit deeper into that?
You know, it's hard to convey, but let's put it this way. The whole enterprise started like a joke.
Really?
Right? We were just a people of passion. We were excited. We couldn't believe it was going to happen, you know? And then when it did, we didn't know how truly historic and transformative it was. I mean, come to think of, we were just all so young. There were 17 and 18-year-old boys walking through the door looking for a job, and they were given the work. And Wilson Arthur, who dreamt of it, it was also a very young man who no one believed owned the station. He owned it, of course, with his wife and his brother. And it was just such a magical thing to happen at a place, especially at a time when economically that city was just sinking. No good thing in 1997 was supposed to happen then. But then this man came, gathered us all young people together, harnessed our passion and our energies and our readiness to give it our all to do it. And so in the beginning, and maybe even for a few years, we didn't know what we were doing. And then it took some time to just, one day you feel the realization that, whoa, hold on here. Something incredible has truly happened. And you were just young boys and girls walking in the city, and people held you at a certain high pedestal that you never imagined yourself being. The things they said about you weren't things you thought about yourself, which is to say, we went into this not wanting or thinking we were going to become local stars or anything, or people who will be celebrated.
Yes.
You know, so all of a sudden at some point you realize you've got a story. You own the story. You've got to tell it. Oh, and by the way, so this has happened 25 years ago, a quarter of a century ago. When I think back, Tessa, it almost felt like that was the first important thing that happened in the entire history of that city or that part of Ghana. And that told me that something is wrong, because I believe a lot more great things had happened before.
Yes.
But we didn't tell those stories. We didn't we didn't bring it together to let others see, to appreciate it, to feel inspired. And so I criticize that as a person to say, where are our stories? Where are the things that happened before the last 25 years? Then I realized, instead of talking, how about I act? How about I be the one that tells the story that is truly inspiring? The one I lived, the one I witnessed.
Amazing. So, I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack there in terms of you didn't believe that it would happen, and you were quite honest in terms of at the beginning, you didn't know what you were doing. You were all young. And I think that kind of brings back something that I've discussed on the show quite a lot in terms of one of Africa's greatest assets is its young population in terms of the energy, the innovation to move the continent forward. How critical do you think it was that this was a private radio station run by young people? How big a factor in its success was that?
Young people have the greatest energy. They have the greatest passion. I actually remember Steve Jobs in a famous interview with Bill Gates.
Yes.
And when he was talking to him, he said, they were successful because they were that young and stupid. And it was a funny way of giving themselves incredible credit, which is to say, you just didn't accept that you can't do it.
Yeah.
You just did it. And of course, as time went by, you look back, you become older and wiser. You are more careful about things. You become more risk averse. And then you go like, wow, we do something. And what's exciting in all of this is that it helps these young ones to take ownership of their own story and their history, because you can't find a people more pitiable than those who have lost their own story and their history. And so these young ones that made it happen just activated the whole environment. For example, I mean, I've spent years on radio where people said to me, Philip, you've got a deep voice. And I never understood what that meant, yes. Right? Because
it's just your voice.
Everyone met me and they would often say, we thought you were a much older person. But that was similar with a lot of, my friends, the young men and women. But I think over time, what happens is when you have spent time on radio communicating as business, as a way of reaching people, you take on characteristics that make you come across as a responsible person. It affects the way you think, the way you interact with people. You sense how much people expect of you. And so as much as you remain young, you grew up. And because you had that extra energy, you gave a lot more. And a lot of young people looked up to you. Older people celebrated you and appreciated you. And it served as a way of recreating a new sort of foundation for a community. And that's what we experienced.
Thank you for sharing that. So I guess community plays a big part in success within a African context. Glad that you've kind of homed in on that aspect in terms of the whole community celebrated what you were doing from young to the older generation. So one thing that drew me into this book was the concept of ownership, as it's one of the elements which I think is extremely important. So from your perspective, how important is private ownership in the context of African media?
Well, first of all, can we take a step back and say it was inconceivable just a few short decades ago
yes,
that a private entity would hold such awesome power. And that's how I define the media. The media has such incredible power to move people. It reminds me of the movie Abraham Lincoln, in which at one point he basically says, I'm the president of the United States, clothed in awesome power, which is true, right? Now, and we saw it every single day. You went into a little room called a studio with a few different devices here and there that are sensitive microphone, knobs here and there, red lights that tells you you're live on air. You come out and you think you've finished work, but the impact you felt on the street was something else. So I think governments realized that power, and when they became the owners of that power, should I say, they became stewards of that power. They wouldn't let it go.
Yes.
But then the thing about governments, people in power, is mostly you can't trust them. And so that's why you like to organize a good system that says, okay, so Teza, you're going to be a governor over me. There are a few things we've got to agree to, okay? How much power do you want over me? And why do you want that much power? Okay, do you realize that power is actually not yours? It belongs to the people by whom you exercise it. Yes. And if you're put in that position, how can we make sure that you're not abusing it? And if you're abusing it, can we agree on how we can boot you out of power very quickly? Because that power will corrupt you very speedily. And so those conversations were not necessarily had in our African context in many ways. No. A lot of things were rushed. And so we were all together. We all together found ourselves in a cage where a lot of this power was exercised. But what happens is that unless you release the energies of the people, where the people feel free, they can't think, they can't invent, they can't be creative, they can't be productive. And so private ownership of the media was necessary in releasing the energies of the people. But of course, in saying that, the importance of responsibility is there. You don't just become an owner and exercise that power. There should be mechanisms that allow people to be able to call you to order if you are not able to control yourself in that way, to use that power in a way that is truly responsible.
Thank you for that. I agree 100%. You mentioned that it would be inconceivable to own a private radio station in Africa decades earlier. We do know before, say, 1990, only a few African countries allowed commercial or non-state radios. So what was the symbolic significance of the launch of Sky Power FM, which is what the book is about?
So let me try to put it in context and, even pull back a little bit to tell you, because I know you have a Nigerian background. A friend of mine who still lives in Nigeria was telling me it was in the mid-1990s that, private radio stations, including Ray Power, yes, which you probably know of, yes, came in. And I actually didn't know this, this was the research stage of my book. And I found it very interesting that wow, just right in the mid-1990s, all these things were happening. So historically in Ghana, when Rawlings was head of state around late 1994, there was a gentleman called Reku Broby. He always saw the dream and wanted private radio stations, but he wasn't given the chance. He applied for the license. In fact, in the book Absolute Radio, I actually stated that the means of applying for such a license didn't even exist. Okay. Yeah. So it's not like there was a particular door you can just go and knock on to say, hey, I'm here.
I've got an application.
So he spent some time talking to the government in Ghana, but they didn't really mind him. Well, then he's a pretty big fighter. So he set up his machine somewhere in Accra and started it off. And then before you knew it, his radio station was on, called Radio I.
Oh, wow.
And illegal according to the rules, because that's what government says. Well, the government was very swift. They quickly came in and seized everything, and that was it. But this was around December 2004. But there was so much pressure on the government from both inside and outside Ghana for the liberalization of the airwaves that in less than a year, by middle of 1995, boom, the very first private radio called Joy FM set up in Accra. And it was unbelievable. The feeling was incredible because you heard people being able to do their own thing, play music without being told what music to play and what music not to play.
Yes.
They gave us news that we recognized as our own, news that wasn't controlled by government. And the music they played, it was just a beautiful thing. Now, what was going to happen to the rest of Ghana from there? Well, it was a long way off. So Sekondi-Takoradi is the third largest city in Ghana. So 2 years later, when Sky Power FM actually happened, that was even more unbelievable because, as I said earlier, Sekondi-Takoradi was economically going down the drain at that time. And the history, as I found, showed that Joy FM had the chance to come and set up there. They went there, did their feasibility studies, and said, this is not going to work. In fact, the current Ghana's High Commissioner to the UK, who was there on the ground, confirmed that, and it's in the book. It actually started that way in chapter 1. So it was just unbelievable that it should happen that way. So people were so excited that what happened in the national capital, Accra, was now being recreated in our own city. And the quality of the sound, this was, FM stereo, as opposed to shortwave or the mono FM that the state broadcaster was broadcasting with, programs that were not that exciting. So it was just incredible, but also the entrepreneurial spirit that brought it out, how someone could dream a big dream and make it happen with next to nothing.
Amazing. So you touched upon the symbolic significance when Joy FM launched in Accra, and also mentioned in terms of Sekondi-Takoradi, it wasn't in a great economic position prior to the launching of Sky Power FM. Were there any economic benefits to the local economy or community that came about directly or indirectly from privatized radio?
It was huge. It was incredible. And it is the ordinary people that talk about it far more than someone like me who was, an employee of the station and who contributed, It was so. What Sky Power FM did in Sekondi-Takoradi was, and a lot of credit goes to this young man called Wilson Arthur. Now an older man. In fact, I haven't met him for quite a number of years. I see his photos on social media and I see gray hair, and I go like, is that really Wilson Arthur? And I'm sure he's going to listen to this interview and hate me for it. But the way I'm talking about him now should tell you the kind of relationship we had. He was almost never a boss, except on a few occasions when he was forced to insist on something. But otherwise, the guy worked exactly like us. And what he really taught us was that the radio station was going to be nothing except what we make it, and the environment was going to prosper only because we make it so. So he took Sekondi-Takoradi like a fallow land, a land that wasn't productive anymore, and said, yeah, we can make it happen. It's land. You've got to cultivate it. You've got to work on it. You've got to let the people believe in themselves. Man, so all of a sudden stuff that Sekondi-Takoradi has never seen before started happening. We had events every weekend. We had musicians from everywhere in Ghana coming. We had, if you can make $1, Wilson Arthur will make you advertise on our station. If you don't have money, he will find a way to make you start making money in order to charge you. So it stimulated economic activity in every conceivable way. And all of a sudden, people began to prosper in ways that none of us could have, foreseen. And people smiled more, people became happier. It's a city that generally has a culture of being happy with its music and culture. And all of that was accelerated incredibly fast, and people began to say that Sekondi-Takoradi and that part of Ghana called Western Region, that they would say Sekondi-Takoradi and Western Region is Sky Power FM, and Sky Power FM is Western Region. And it was just a thing to see. And again, I look back and I'm able to speak about it with a lot more clarity. Back then, we were just in the thick of it and didn't know what was happening. Everything was moving so fast and so exciting, and lives were being transformed right in front of our eyes. Human resource was being transformed. Education was getting better. Commerce was getting better. Everywhere you see, it was like, I think in the book, I used a phrase that said that sky became like a sunshine that touched every aspect of life in this city. And more than that, the human resource developed there spread to other parts of Ghana. So much so that one of my former colleagues actually says, nobody has done as much for private broadcasting in Ghana as much as Wilson Arthur has done as an individual, which it's just incredible what it is that happened back then.
That's fantastic to hear. You've touched on some key themes there, but I think from my kind of understanding, sometimes we don't fully appreciate the power of media, the power of also local industry and how it can empower and galvanize a community and a whole ecosystem. So you've mentioned in terms of the symbolic significance and how it stimulated the local economy at that current time. So what are some of the positive or negative, say, legacies that were left in that region by Sky Power FM?
It's funny you asked that question, right? Because a few days ago, I was thinking, and I was just having this conversation with my wife. And one of the things I kind of struggle with is not to make it seem like everything was absolutely rosy.
Yes.
But then I asked myself, so what were the negative things that I could have highlighted? And I struggled to find out, to pinpoint it. Right?
You're more than welcome to just tell me the positives.
But not to be negative, but I think what has happened over all these years is there's now a glut of new radio stations across, because based on the success of these first one, it seemed like you could put 1,000 radio stations there and they could reproduce exactly the same result. So I guess in some ways, it kind of slowed down what was a positive thing, But don't get me wrong, more voices is actually better for any community, So in terms of the positive things, it lies in the transformation of individual lives. It made people believe, a group of people believe in themselves again in a portion of Ghana that was suffering at the time. In fact, as I said, there's actually a culture there where people were generally very positive in nature. And that is why, long before Sky Power FM came, there was this saying that the best comes from the West, which is the Western region of Ghana, and as a result of the success that touched every aspect of life in that part of Ghana, that saying came to have a greater meaning, and so it was just inspiring to see how people's lives were transformed business-wise, how they began to believe more in themselves and how their outlook on life was positive or became far more positive.
Thank you for sharing that, Philip. You mentioned how Sky Power FM stimulated local industry and commerce. So I think there's a very distinct theme within the book in terms of business and entrepreneurship. Do you mind giving us a bit more detail about that regarding the business and entrepreneurship mindset that drove the company forward?
So one of the things that worked for Wilson Arthur, who dreamt of the station, is that he was a marketing professional. He spent time in England schooling, where he became a chartered marketer. So he comes down empty-handed with nothing, not much in terms of resources. And he could just tell how to make things work business-wise. Okay? Let me give you an example. So I'm sitting with this boss of mine. It was a time when, Ghanaians love boxing. You will remember Azuma Nelson, the greatest African boxing legend. And so those days, man, when Azuma Nelson goes to fight somewhere, you will be fortunate to see it. It's not always guaranteed that you would, because sometimes it's available on satellite, but generally the national broadcaster will rebroadcast it. But then there's another guy called Ike Quartey who also fought, and a new company came to town, and they came to us as a radio station and said, look, can you make us popular in town so we can make some money? And Wilson says, he looks at a newspaper right in front of him and says, okay, this weekend, Ike Quartey is fighting. All right, so what we're going to do is this. He calls a couple of people and say, prepare a jingle right now. Say that this company is going to sponsor the fight. We're going to do a live broadcast of the fight, on our radio station. This is the place where you can hear every moment of it. And within like 5 minutes, this guy put together a plan for a company. And this company over time became incredibly successful because of that. A company comes to town, it says it's selling milk, tins of milk. Wilson has a way of just creating a marketing message that makes people want to do it. He knows how to bring people together to stimulate economic activity. And we saw that happening over and over again. And he will always say to you, you don't need money to make things work. Of course, we didn't always agree at that time. But what has happened now is, and one of the colleagues I interviewed for the book, and she has a chapter, now runs her own business in America, Abena Bonda. She says, back then, we didn't clearly understand what this guy was doing, but he had entrepreneurial spirit. He knew how to turn businesses around, and he knew that it doesn't take money to bring success. It takes creativity, because people have the energies. You just stimulate them, give them a reason to come together, and boom, stuff happens all the time. So, and the reason why I was impressed with it is the fact that this character got replicated in one of my colleagues, one of the colleagues that was also an employee there. And it is thought that as a result, he actually became more financially successful than our own boss, than our own original enterprise.
Wow, that's amazing.
And he ended up, and I think he'll be happy for me to mention his name. The story is in the book anyway. Kwame Dumante. He ended up owning a number of radio stations himself, owning a construction company, a distribution company, and on and on and on. And when I interviewed him, he says he gets bored if he doesn't keep doing business and making things happen, And so that's an example of how Wilson started it using the radio station as a tool, and it affected so many people so that we could say, generations of beneficiaries as we speak.
Fantastic. So it seems like great leadership, vision, and innovation were key to the success of Sky Power FM.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. But also to point out briefly that Wilson Arthur is the first to say he is imperfect, and because he lowered himself to our level so much, we saw a lot more of it, that he was just a very ordinary guy. But years after you've known him, you think, boy, he's got something in that head. He's got business ideas that works. And God forbid if he fails. If he fails in one thing, he will do 10 more things that would make him successful.
I guess that's an important message when it comes to business and entrepreneurship. I think it's one thing that we've discussed quite a lot on this podcast is how we reframe our thought process or how we see failure. Failure is just another path or route to success. If something doesn't work, you just try again.
Yeah, and he did it over and over again. In the end, he built a recording studio. He built multiple radio stations afterwards. He built a restaurant. You just name it and he would do it. He developed talents, and people in their great numbers all look back and feel like, all right, it all started from here. This is the guy that made it work. And I kind of remember this saying that maybe try not to meet your heroes because sometimes you are disappointed, and I feel kind of happy that I've had a chance to write a book that does justice to this guy, our former boss, Wilson Arthur, because he's as ordinary is, but he did extraordinary things that touched the lives of so many.
Amazing. A point that we touched upon earlier in the conversation was post-independence media systems in Africa could be described as almost partisan press. Can you tell us from your perspective the importance or positives that you saw from free and open media?
I remember in 1992 in Ghana, when Ghana was getting back into democracy, there were a few newspapers that represented a lot of pain for the government, one of them being the Free Press and then also the Ghanaian Chronicle, which I wrote for later on. Now, they were extremely important in freeing the people because governments by nature are not open to give people the freedom they deserve. They have to be pushed most of the time. And there's this saying that sunshine is a very, very good disinfectant. Private media is that sunshine, not because it is itself the best thing that ever happened, because it's got its own issues, because it's run by people, but on any occasion, you should rather have that than not having it at all. So I saw how it actually helped people to become more expressive, more creative. And mind you, as much as, yes, freedom of expression tends to be the main thing, free and independent media also promotes businesses. Because if you don't have a free media, well, then how are businesses going to grow? Because businesses need to advertise, need to be able to tell their own stories, need to be able to attract talents and so on and so forth. So that's what I saw in Ghana. And this was replicated across Africa and the world. Of course, it is true that much of the rest of the world have had independent media for a very long time. And the fact that it is not a perfect institution also shows how over time it creates its own problem as well. So there's always this fine balance that has to be promoted. I look at the state media state media is important in as long as it is also independent to a very large extent. And I think of, say, the National Public Radio in America, and maybe a better example is the BBC in the UK, where BBC has that strong independence, so much so that those in government, those in authority should rather be afraid of them rather than the opposite, rather than journalists and people, media practitioners being afraid of leaders. Leaders are supposed to be servants of the people. The fourth estate, being the media, are simply there to give confidence to the people that they can be assured that things are not being done in the dark, mostly in their name.
Fantastic. So you've given us a great overview or insight into the positives that you saw back then from a free and open media. So if we look more currently, how do you believe the media in Africa or maybe Ghana has evolved, say, over the last 10 years?
I think it is sad to say over time, much of the media has lost its bite. And I wish I knew all the factors that contributed. But a big one is economics, where governments or great institutions have found a way to buy the media and own them and control them. And in some ways, it's as if it then begins to get worse than what it was in colonial times.
Interesting.
What would you rather have? A house without a dog? Or a dog that doesn't bark at all, that is as good as dead. So, these are people that I respect a lot, that I like a lot, because I'm one of them as a journalist. But I look at them and I'm thinking, this is not a journalism we were taught to practice. You can't be there and become a coward. You can't be there and let yourself be bored. You can't work and not have a conscience, So there are just a few, too few, who are still there and working with integrity. But otherwise, there's too much of it that is going down the drain, and then you think, what's the way forward? What's the way out when you can't have the people who are supposed to watch those who may abuse power, rather aid them in abusing power, in being corrupt, in just wasting resources that does not belong to them. So yeah, it is a bit of a sad story on that front.
So you touched upon there that you believe that Africa's media has lost its bite or bark over the last 10 years in terms of its current shape or how it communicates information to the masses. So in your opinion, what are the main, say, micro or macro factors that influence Africa's media at the moment?
I think institutions of power can be very coercive, especially in Africa. And when you don't have enough of an exposure where you know how to stand up for yourself, and when you are mostly hungry and you add a little bit of greed to it, you've got an absolute disaster on your hand. Because when you're hungry, you don't think anymore. You will receive, very little things to do a lot of damage to your own self without realizing, Tessa. So let's say I go back to Africa somewhere and I go like, hey, you know what? I can see you've got this bag of seed. I can see you're just about to boil it and eat it all. I've got an advice for you. Please plant it, okay? And after you plant it in a year, you can harvest about 10 times more what you've got now. They look at me, turn around and say, look, Phil, we're going to die tomorrow or before the end of this week. And you're telling me to invest in something that would take a whole year to bring. You're not serious, So in some ways, I kind of try to understand it that way that, yeah, when you don't have that power to feed yourself, when you don't have that willpower to stop yourself from being greedy, then a lot goes wrong for you as someone who has the duty to watch society and be sure that things are done right. And when it's not done right, you throw a light on it. So I think those are the biggest factors. And I think that entities, tiny little entities like yours, your podcast, for example, will become the little bits of light that can change things. Sometimes you don't have to have a massive source of light to make a difference. But if you have a million little lights, it makes a big difference. And that's what outfits like yours can do, where you can slowly ignore the media houses that are no longer playing their role and turn to individual producers because they believe in what they are doing, bring out stories that better represent the people.
Fantastic. And that actually leads on to my next question in terms of what do you think is the importance of decentralized or democratized media platforms? I'm not trying to kind of promote myself, but how important do you believe they are in terms of telling the African story and playing a part how we communicate what is happening on the continent?
Thank goodness for the technology. Man, thank goodness for technology. When I started in journalism, we didn't have the internet at all. But now, all you need is a couple of equipment, not too much of an investment, and with time, determination, and then you can make a difference. And I would just have to use, again, your podcast, Unlocking Africa as an example. You started, if I'm right, less than a year ago, right?
Yeah, 8 months.
Well, but look at the impact. Look at the people you have empowered, whether you are aware of it or not. Look at the people you've given, hope to. Look at the people who you've interviewed and who say, "Hey, actually, I have a story that someone is interested in."
Yes.
And sure, your focus is more business, which is important because any environment that is without business is dead. Business is everything, really.
Very true.
Alongside that, there are other kinds of podcasts that focus on other important issues as well. And even they have to have some sort of business as a backbone in order to run. So decentralization is probably what has been holding us from the brink. Without it, perhaps things would have gone back to what it was and worse a long time ago. Of course, we have the fear that it is heading in that direction, but at least it is not that fast and it's being slowed down by the decentralized media where all you need is a few people who believe in themselves, believe in a cause, and then do a podcast or get on YouTube or any one of these online presence to make a difference.
Fantastic. Thank you, Philip. So you've touched upon decentralized media is key to the future of Africa's media industry. As you are a journalism professional, how do you think the way that we utilize the media in Africa will change in 5 years' time? Do you think we'll see more platforms such as this, more podcasts? What direction do you think it will go?
Without doubt, we will see it. Come to think of it, it started with just blogs, people blogging, right? All of a sudden, we realized that, well, there's so much information coming through that sometimes it feels like you're drinking from a fire hose. So let's do the videos and the audios, and there's going to be a lot more of that. In fact, in the last 3 months, I've spoken to maybe 3 of my friends who are starting a radio station, and the radio station is sitting on their cheap computer connected to the internet, and they can play music and record voices and play and on and on and on.
Amazing.
So those outfits are really going to take over. You see, gone are the days when it was broadcasting meant the few or one talking to so many. Now it is many talking to many.
Yes.
Everybody can be a broadcaster. Everyone can broadcast. In fact, I want to listen to your podcast all day, and very soon you will be listening to mine as well.
Yes.
We are then beginning to exchange ideas even more than we've ever had to. So in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, that's what's going to happen. traditional media is going the way of Kodak. It is nice to see that some of them who are not living up to their responsibilities don't even realize it. So they're going to really fall really hard. Because if you employed someone today as a journalist, well, that one person could generate a lot more influence because they can broadcast on Facebook, and on Twitter or Clubhouse or wherever else, So what will eventually happen is the good ones are going to be separated from the bad ones. And it will no longer be that, authorities will target a particular media house to obliterate or make life hard for them. But you're not fighting against an army. It's a guerrilla warfare where you don't know who the next person who is going to attack you is coming from, and you can't be able to control all the people all of the time. Only some of the time, but not all of the time.
You touched on a key point there, which was the importance of, building and leveraging your personal community and networks in terms of how you advertise and build a decentralized platform such as a podcast. So if we look closer to home, obviously you touched upon a point there that you'll be doing a lot more podcasting yourself in the near future. So where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What will you be doing?
How about I tell you what happened 5 years ago?
Okay.
5 years ago, I was in Ghana with my family. My son was 6 years old at the time. So we were in a car being driven kindly by someone. And we stopped the car in front of the bank. And then my boy immediately started asking me, so what had happened is we had just gone to that old radio station I was working for, Sky Power FM. And then he starts asking me all these questions. In fact, the way he started, I just knew he didn't have 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So I had the presence of mind to tell our driver to start recording both of us as he was asking the questions. And the questions were, how was your life like when you were in Ghana? And how was it like when you were working as a journalist? And when you were working as a journalist and you were reporting difficult, painful stories, how was it that you didn't cry while doing the job? And on and on. I'm not making this up because it's on my YouTube. We did a 12-minute documentary of it, right? When we came back to Australia. And it awakened something in me because I'm thinking, I'm not sure he actually knew what he was asking, but there is that brilliance you find in every single child, boy or girl, where you just have to keep encouraging it. Yes. And that's what I saw. And it was at that moment I said to myself, I've got to write a book to tell the story, to answer the questions this boy is asking, because our stories are us. We don't own anything in a true sense of the word apart from our stories, who we are. Oh, it is our stories that still speak when we are no longer active. When we are lying in the grave, there'll be a story about us, So 5 years ago, that's what happened. 5 years later, I had to bring it into fruition. So looking forward, that's what I want to see. I want to see that 5 years from now, we're having another conversation of another set of stories that we're telling because they are relevant. Another set of stories because they are important, because they represent us, because we cannot afford to lose our own stories. If we lose our stories, we lose ourselves. And you should be able to lose everything, but not yourself. So in the next 5 years, we should have more of these. Just less than 2 weeks ago, the African Mining Professionals Association of Australia, recognizing that I have some contribution to make, invited me to lead a panel discussion about the welfare, the importance of the African professional in Australia. And I was very happy about that because I thought, well, that's one avenue of contributing to continue to create stories, to live it, to be able to benefit other people in a community.
Thank you for sharing that personal story and also an important message. We all have a story to tell, and it will be great to hear more stories coming from Africa. And I'm hoping that you will be bringing out another book, hopefully in 5 years' time.
It is my absolute expectation to do that.
Brilliant.
It is.
Brilliant.
In fact, I intend to keep telling stories in audio and video and communicating that way, and also helping other people communicate, because the ways we communicate is in audio, is in video, is in writing, is in the ways we collaborate. So those are things that are going to continue to happen.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, even African proverbs, or even affirmations that keep us going when times are hard or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
There's one that comes to mind. I'm not able to tell you exactly who said the original. So if the person who said it hears it, I apologize. But it goes something like this, that if you are successful, if you raise your children successfully, nothing else matters. And if you are not able to raise your children successfully, it's the same result. Nothing else matters. I heard it somewhere years ago. And when I became a father, it took on a greater meaning for me, because I thought, yeah, it's really all about people. And it starts from the home. And if those of us who are fortunate to have the privilege of looking after children, whether they are our own children, biologically or not, if we can be successful in that, not too many things will matter anymore. And it's the same if we fail. And that has lived with me. I feel it's such a powerful thing, because so many problems, just about every problem you can think of starts from the home. So how about we sort it out there, stop it there? And it also brings to mind, when I was doing one of the interviews for the book, one gentleman called Eloy Amande, he was a teenager when I was news editor, and we reported on something called the National Reconciliation Commission in Ghana. This is back in 2002, I think. And I took him there where at that Reconciliation Commission, people were coming out with stories of abuse that they suffered through the decades. And it was kind of arranged for people to talk about it and find a way to overcome it. So as a community, people move forward. Well, unknown to me, this had a negative impact, a powerful but negative impact on Eloy. And when I talked to him about it, he says, Phil, you guys shouldn't have let me report that, because he had nightmares, he cried a lot. And he never told me back then. I felt bad and I apologized to him, on that interview. And I actually wrote about it in the book. So I said that as I reflected, I couldn't help but think that each of us is likely a complex collection of billion pieces of memories, both good and bad, and somewhere in between. And what it tells me is that, again, it comes back to the stories that are our own, that we have to own and hold, which is why I've written this book, Absolute Radio, that if it helps other people to be able to tell their own story, to own it, because when you are not telling your story, when you don't own your story, you can be sure somebody else will be telling it for you in a way that doesn't benefit you.
Amazing. So I guess the key theme or points there is about going back to basics, going back to the beginning, building legacy, community, family is important. And I guess the impact that we have on people immediate to us or extended to us is important. And I think we don't sometimes fully realize that. Thank you for sharing that, Philip.
My pleasure.
So as we're coming to the end of the conversation, do you have any closing remarks and final calls to action?
Teza, I would just like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to just talk. You might call it an interview, but it felt very much like a conversation.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
And conversations are important because that's how we keep our stories as well. And what I've sought to do in this book is to honor the dozens of boys and girls who made this story happen in a way that benefits generations to come over the last 25 years. And if it goes some way to help other people tell these stories, then my job is done, because I truly appreciate what all those young men and women did. So young they were, and today they've grown. They're living in different parts of the world. In fact, one of them, Nadole Thompson, as I was interviewing him, was then that I found out that she ended up working in the White House in the United States after, coming to Sky as a young lady who just came on radio and was trained to be part of the radio stations. And it just shows you how we might start from somewhere, but you just never know how far it takes us. And between where we start and where we get to, in between, are these wondrous stories of our lives that we should continue to hold special.
Amen. Amen. What a wonderful way to end today's conversation. That's been an amazing conversation. First class insight and personal stories, teachings and learnings. I've thoroughly enjoyed that, Phillip. So thank you for giving us some of your time today and joining us all the way from sunny Australia.
Thank you, Tessa. It's a pleasure. And I look forward to meeting you, if not in the UK, then right here in the beautiful, sunny Perth, Western Australia.
Hopefully we'll get some surfing in together somewhere. It's been a pleasure, Phillip, and look forward to keeping in contact and hearing even more stories in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week with the Unlocking Africa podcast.